Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about executive functions and reading comprehension and how these fit together. Among the many facets of literacy, reading comprehension remains the most powerful predictor of long-term academic success. Recent analytics from my own readership confirm this reality, with nearly 43% of the visitors engaging with comprehension-focused content. For educators, this reflects not just an interest, but perhaps a sense of urgency. Because if students cannot derive meaning from what they read, then every subject from science to history is going to really remain out of reach to them. While decoding and vocabulary are very well studied, executive functions such as working memory, cognitive flexibility, inhibition and planning play a far less visible but a very critical role nonetheless in reading comprehension. So there's an increase in the amount of research being done in this area, and it increasingly shows that executive functions play a vital role in reading comprehension alongside decoding and oral language. But the mechanisms surrounding the association between executive functions and reading comprehension remain a little bit blurred because of the challenges of research in this area. And I'm going to be talking about that in a little while. So first of all, a meta-analysis of 197 studies, which consisted of 2,026 effect sizes, revealed an interesting change in the development of reading skills. Researchers showed that different aspects of working memory support early reading development up to year 5 or 4th grade. And beyond this, verbal memory becomes more critical for young readers. And this is really not so surprising because vocabulary development basically happens when children are reading once they get to about 10 years old, if not before. And so verbal memory is going to really represent all of those newer words that you are more likely to encounter in books rather than in everyday conversation. Now let's move on to a meta-analytic review of 6,673 papers on the relationship between executive function and reading comprehension. In these papers, there was no overall effect of age, therefore reading development, or of the type of measure that was used to gather the data. But the results did show a moderate association between executive functions and reading comprehension, and this varied on the type of executive function. In other words, whether it was planning or working memory or inhibitive control. So taking this forward, last year a study was published highlighting, again, the association between executive functions and reading comprehension skills for Chilean children, and they were aged between 9 and 10 years old. It was interesting to read this study because some of them had reading comprehension difficulties and they were compared with those that did not have those difficulties. The children who were developing in the typical way, those without the difficulties, they relied on working memory skills to absorb what they were reading, whereas those with reading comprehension difficulties leaned far more on cognitive flexibility. So cognitive flexibility can be understood very easily if you think about a bilingual child. When that child is at school, they're going to be speaking one language with everybody in the school. When they go home, perhaps they speak a different language. So the context is associated with the language, and the cognitive flexibility is the child's response in terms of switching between languages, depending on whether they're at school or at home, or perhaps between speaking to mum or dad. The child is discovering when to apply different skills. So for children with reading comprehension difficulties, cognitive flexibility turns out to be the skill, the executive function that they lean on the most. This is very much in alignment with my own experience. I've been assessing children before and after the Rhythm for Reading programme all around the UK, apart from Northern Ireland, and I've listened to them at baseline and at follow-up. So what I've noticed is that these children who are usually targeted because their reading comprehension is lagging behind where they could be, and they generally do not use working memory because the automaticity of phonemic awareness is not quite there, so they don't have working memory capacity available. At the end of the programme, they are able to demonstrate far more sensitivity to the text. They're able to respond in the moment. They're able to discover exactly what the words are that they want to read. And I'm convinced just through observation that this is all about cognitive control and cognitive flexibility. I think that using rhythm can enhance those executive functions, as well as, it's very difficult to isolate them, as well as probably enhancing inhibitive control as well, meaning that they got better self-regulation all round. Right, so the main implication of all of the studies that are out there at the moment is that we need a more nuanced approach to the way that we are supporting children with reading comprehension difficulties in particular. Now, I just want to talk about the limitations of using educational research in this context, because there's a vast difference between reading comprehension in the classroom and the type of reading comprehension that is studied in educational research. Ecological validity, that's well-controlled, classroom-based research, attempts to bridge the gap between what happens in the everyday classroom and what happens in a formal research-based context. Large-scale databases, in particular, tend to flatten research findings because all the data is aggregated. And while they may provide interesting headlines, the application of the research is quite limited because we can't say, well, exactly who are we talking about, because the data sets are so large. Smaller studies are far more nuanced, but to the point at which they also have limited application because every child is unique. So if you just have a small group of unique children, it's difficult to say that what's happened to those children is going to apply and be generalized to other children in schools more generally. Executive functions are not actually fixed. This is another issue. They are actually relatively fluid. And so for this reason, not only can they not be isolated easily, but it's difficult to define them because they're developing from infancy right up until individuals become about 24, 25 years of age. So executive functions are responding all the time to the child's interaction with their environment, whether that's home, family or school, or wider cultural influences such as social and mainstream media. And before we throw our hands up in despair because this all sounds so very complicated, let's flip the script. I would just like to say that executive functions definitely offer a huge opportunity for educators to narrow, if not close, attainment gaps and level the playing field. In my opinion, and in my experience of working with so many children over decades now, executive functions are where the proverbial rubber meets the road. Those children with reading comprehension difficulties in particular, they benefit so much from using a rhythm-based approach, and we're able to modulate the development of executive functions such as inhibitive control, working memory, and cognitive control, self-regulation, and cognitive flexibility. All of these things are improved at the end of a 10-week rhythm-based program. Learning to work with rhythm isn't something that educators would normally be trained to do in their initial teacher training. I understand that. But actually, it's time for us to really turn that around on its head and put rhythm first. And I'd love to invite you to my webinars. I'm running these on Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. London European time. If you'd like to find out about 10-minute sessions that support transformation, then the link will be in the description below, and I can't wait to see you soon. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.